So basically, Israel colonized the land in different phases. It was very slow and incremental. There was never one entire sweep of ethnic cleansing, and it was very slowly, and it's been going. It's a continuum, very slow continuum. And in the early 90s, so right around when your negotiations were happening and your democracy was being established, we had the Oslo Accords, which were negotiating the setup of a future Palestinian state. And that state was supposed to be built on 22% of historic Palestine, which is West Bank, Gaza, and then East Jerusalem as the capital. But throughout that entire period, Israel was constantly colonizing that land as well, that 22%. So when the negotiations started, there were about 100,000 Jewish Israeli settlers. Now they're almost close to 1 million. So they never stopped, and they kept taking more land and forcing different realities and then starting to negotiate from those realities. And our leadership in those negotiations accepted the Bantustans, and they accepted to be the leaders of that Bantustan. At least I got your first name right. You know, I fucked up your last name.
So let me start over. So I promised last week that I will have more sessions where I speak to the audience directly. So I think this week I'll switch it up a little bit. I have a guest here with me. Salem is from Palestine, and he's one of the activists in Palestine, really going against what we already try and dealt with the past 100 of years. I think 100 years. So I don't want to start with 1948 because 1948 is kind of a skewed timeline for me. But there's also started around about the same time, apartheid, like the formal level of apartheid. But something that we have been struggling here for 100 years with, and what we have seen in South Africa is the various variations of and the various phases of that. So I don't want to name it yet. I will name it now. So Salem, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope we'll have an abrasive conversation. We'll have a conversation about what is currently happening in Palestine. And I don't want it to be a South African narrative because I think the South African public is under-informed about what is currently happening in Palestine. And that's really the reason why I'm having this today. I want to have an open conversation about Palestine from a South African perspective and just ask questions and allow Salem to really answer all of the questions that we might not know. So Salem, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, man. Anytime.
So I'll start with the first question, and the most obvious question would be, if my phone just go on. Please tell us about apartheid in Palestine. When did it happen? And how has it kind of manifest up until where it's today?
Yeah, so for us, 1948 is a very, catastrophic time. We call it the Nakba, which means the catastrophe in Arabic, and it's when the state of Israel was created on the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians, roughly. And these Palestinians were forced out, and now they and their descendants live as refugees. And so Israel started, erecting a system of apartheid through its settler colonialism of trying to settle all the land. In 1967, they occupied the rest of it, which includes what is known as the occupied territories, which is the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. But in reality, the occupation extends from the river to the sea. And there's a pursuit of this idea of greater Israel, which is a very biblical thing.
Yeah.
They refer to a lot of the land as Judea and Samaria, by its Jewish biblical names. And so there are 14 million people living in that land today. There's about 7 million Jewish Israelis, and there's 7 million Palestinians, who are actually now the majority. And the ideology that governs this idea of Jewish supremacy is Zionism, which is a very much colonial idea and ideology. And there are different tiers. So Jewish Israelis have the full spectrum of rights. They can almost live anywhere. They have all the types of freedoms. Everything is geared to their privilege. And then Palestinians are put into different rights based on where they are. So if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you have some rights, but you're treated as a second-class citizen. If you're from Jerusalem, you don't have any type of citizenship. You're just a resident. And there's discrimination whether you're a citizen or a resident in terms of the allocation of resources, your rights, all of it. And then Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are under Israeli military law. So the Israeli military is the supreme authority.
Okay. Can I quickly go in there? Because we are also familiar with terms like settler colonialism. So, and I don't want the audience to kind of confuse with settler colonialism here. So, just give an explanation. Is what does settler colonialism really means in this particular context is really similar, but what's the timeline? You said 1948, but what happened before 1948? To who did the land belong, or what was the nationality? Stuff like that. So under the Ottoman Empire, there was different districts, and the identity of Palestinians and Palestinian Arabs existed and was formulated. And people there were predominantly Muslim, but there were also Christians and Jews living together within that distinct identity. And in the late 1900s, the movement for Zionism in Europe started to really take hold. Because there was a big debate in Europe of how to confront anti-Semitism. The majority of Jews actually wanted to assimilate in their own countries where they lived and have the extent of rights in whatever country they lived in, Germany, France, etc. But Zionism was a periphery that started to become more popular with the extreme violence against the Jewish people in Europe. And so this idea of a Jewish state promoted by Zionism started to take hold, and Jewish migration started to Palestine very early on, and there was the start of the colonization of the land. And it was under British rule that it was called the Balfour Declaration. The land was promised to the Jewish people at our expense because it was the British mandate of Palestine at the time. And so the British left in the late 40s after World War II. Obviously, the occurrence of the tragedy of the Holocaust, I think, kind of exacerbated the need for Jewish security away from Europe. So the idea of Israel got a lot of support. And so then there was partition of the land. So there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state. And this was all driven by a colonial...
Colonial, exactly. And so...
And there was no democratic or consultative process?
No. Basically, it was given by the British. It was not theirs to give. And then the states were created under the newly formed United Nations. And obviously, as the indigenous population, Palestinians rejected the idea of partitioning the land and giving it to people that started predominantly arriving in the last 30, 40, 50 years.
So, and that resulted in this, what you just explained now is the tiered identity that is also based on racial discrimination in terms of law. Can I call it race, or is it, must I think of it ethnicity or culture?
I think it's ethnonational identity because, it's Palestinian or Jewish Israeli, and it depends on that identity and where you fall there, and it's also based on geographic location, right? So if you're a citizen of Israel, if you live in what we call 48 Palestine, you have the most amount of rights in relation to other Palestinians, still less than a Jewish Israeli. And then the hierarchy goes down. And so as a Palestinian from the West Bank, we have the least amount of rights. And then obviously there are people who can return is a very strong conversation, because we have 7 million Palestinians who are refugees. A lot of them can't come to visit, let alone come live there. But any Jewish person anywhere in the world can come and immediately become a citizen of Israel.
Like the Ukraine.
Exactly. So, for example,
just explain about the.
Yeah.
Ukraine.
So before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Israel was taking in Jewish Ukrainians to Israel to become citizens, and it just shows you that how the system of settler colonialism and apartheid offers privilege to one group over another, because Palestinians can't come and return.
So what you're essentially saying is that you can be a Jew in every part of the world,
and you can
be a citizen tomorrow in
Israel,
and live. But if you are a Palestinian that is originally from that area, that is forced into exile, you can never return because that is not
even visit.
You can't even visit.
They don't let you in, and so and just to complete the circle, these Israeli cities were built on the rubble of Palestinian villages that were destroyed and ethnically cleansed in 1948, right? And it just shows you the structure of settler colonialism and apartheid, right? Because we don't live in a vacuum. Of course, we should be helping refugees who are fleeing war. That's not the question. The question is, what is the structure and the system we're operating in, and what is the system of supremacy and privilege we're operating in? And to answer your question fully, and not to lean on the example of South Africa too much, but this system is based on structural violence. It's constant violence, whether it's fascist Israeli settlers who are now colonizing parts of the West Bank, which were supposed to be the future Palestinian state. Where I live, in the city I live, I look out of my bedroom and I see 2 Israeli settlements, colonies. And even though we live a hill apart, we have fundamentally different rights. We have fundamentally different access to infrastructure and resources. They take our water. They have 7 days of running water a week. We have 2. And it's our water because it's running under the West Bank. It's our aquifer. So in every facet of life, there is form of segregation and privilege.
All right. So it leads me to the next question, is that what a lot of people might not know is that you practically live in a Bantustan. So these settlements or what you're describing about the partition and how the Jewish or Zionism can take to control over and then explain how this and how you started with life there, but I think South Africans really understands the Bantustan system. So explain how it works So
basically, Israel colonized the land in different phases. It was very slow and incremental. There was never one entire sweep of ethnic cleansing, and it was very slowly, and it's been going. It's a continuum, very slow continuum, and. In the early 90s, so right around when your negotiations were happening and your democracy was being established, we had the Oslo Accords, which were negotiating the setup of a future Palestinian state. And that state was supposed to be built on 22% of historic Palestine, which is West Bank, Gaza, and then East Jerusalem as the capital. But throughout that entire period, Israel was constantly colonizing that land as well, that 22%. So when the negotiations started, there were about 100,000 Jewish Israeli settlers. Now they're almost close to 1 million. So they never stopped, and they kept taking more land and forcing different realities and then starting to negotiate from those realities. And our leadership in those negotiations accepted the Bantustans. And they accepted to be the leaders of that Bantustan. And now if you look at a map of Palestine, very much looks like the map of South Africa with the Bantustans, where you have Palestinians living in small population centers in different parts of the country, and the rest of it is under full Israeli control. I mean, we're still living under Israeli control, but they give us very limited self-governance and autonomy. and say, okay, you deal with your own selves and we'll control all of you. And this is the fundamental difference, I think, between the South African and the Palestinian experience, because I learned yesterday that Nelson Mandela was made the same offer. Go be the chief of one of the Bantustans and that should be good enough for you. Maybe it's about the myth or whatever, but he rejected that. Our leadership accepted that. And so that killed our version of the ANC, which was the PLO. So our liberation struggle was no longer for the liberation of all the people. It became about securing as a bit of power and taking the breadcrumbs. And it deflated the entire national movement. And now the national movement is it's becoming resurgent because this idea of partition is being rejected by the younger generation, by our generation, and saying, actually, we want to liberate Palestine.
Okay, so in terms of the Bantustan experience, is the past system. Can you please tell us about the past system?
So I'll give you a very personal example. I was born in Jerusalem. I'm sure people know Jerusalem because of the Bible, but I was born in Jerusalem and I went to school to Jerusalem. But when you become 16, you essentially become an adult under the Israeli system. So you get an ID. Israelis have blue IDs, Palestinians have green IDs. In the ID, there's everything, all your information. Your name, your father's name, your mother's name, what religion you're from, what city you're from. And based on that is what allows you to move. You never leave the house with that. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. And so people from the West Bank and Gaza, to be able to travel into Jerusalem or any Palestinian city inside Israel, they need a permit that is given by the Israeli military, and they do a security check. And that permit is very much regulated to specific times, to specific places. And so when I was 16, I needed a permit to go to the school I always went to, in the city I was born in. And there are some cities in 48 Palestine that I never visited until I was an adult. So in a way, they took away my experience of my own land, and I felt like a foreigner in it. And if you are caught without a permit, you get beaten, you get thrown into jail, and then kicked out, you're sent back to the West Bank. But also it's a system to regulate very cheap labor, which I think is something that also resonates within this context. Israelis use Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza as cheap labor. They've suffocated our economy because they control all the entry and exit points. So we cannot import or export anything. And if we do, we have to pay double the tax. We don't have access to 60% of the West Bank, which is our agricultural areas, potential industrial areas. We don't have access to our water. So in terms of building a real robust economy, it's being suffocated by this colonial structure. And so that causes a lot of unemployment. And so that develops a labor base for the Israelis. And so through that permit regime, they bring in cheap labor into Israel to work as their construction, build their roads, to work in their restaurants, etc. And people go in every day and back to their villages, to their towns, to their cities through this pass system.
You know, that is exactly how apartheid works. So it sounds like apartheid. So if people find it difficult to name it, I will name it.
Yeah.
I will say it's apartheid. If people call it anything else, is there another version that they're calling it in Israel to describe what is happening in Palestine?
Well, Israel describes itself as a democracy. They don't even recognize that there's so the lowest base of recognition of this oppression is occupation, right? And I think there's a consensus around the world that some of Palestine is occupied. But the understanding in the West is that Israel is a democracy at home, but it has an occupation across the Green Line, which is West Bank, etc. And they don't understand that the regime actually is the same from the river to the sea in the entire land. So now there's been a debate in Palestinian society about what do we call it. And I think there's a firm understanding amongst the majority that it's a settler colonial regime manifesting as apartheid. And that's the now where the conversation is. And I think many human rights organizations are catching up to calling it apartheid. So apartheid is actually becoming the dominant term in public discourse, not just in Palestine, but all over the world.
But I think we need to name it apartheid because apartheid is a crime against humanity.
Yeah.
Which is already recognized by the UN. But
Yeah.
if the UN recognizes that, which is dominated by the US, then it becomes different to have an ally in the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's the trajectory we're going on now. So just before I came to South Africa a few weeks ago, Amnesty International was the latest international human rights organization to release a report. It was over 200 pages of very critical analysis that comes to the conclusion that it's an apartheid regime. Israeli human rights organizations have come out and said it's apartheid. Palestinians have been, and human rights organizations and activists have been saying this for a very long time. So the world is starting to catch up and the narrative is heading that way.
So, interesting thing that I'm hearing. So there is support for the Palestinian cause in Jerusalem, not in Israel, amongst the Jewish people.
I'm sure it's very similar to here. You have people who are liberal Zionists who still operate under the model that Israel is a democracy, but there's an occupation.
Yeah.
And they very much promote this idea of partition and segregation. And they come at it from a very liberal point of view. Then you have a very small minority that are essentially experimenting with this ideology of anti-Zionism and rejecting the very colonial nature of the state. And those are allies, right?
Okay.
And these are some of the human rights organizations who have come out to call it apartheid.
Yeah. So I think I have a couple of one or two questions more.
Yeah.
I don't want it to.
No.
So if the last two questions is uncomfortable, three questions is uncomfortable for you, you don't have to answer it. But
It's Abrasive Media. I feel like I have to answer.
how many people have been killed?
In Palestine?
Yeah.
A lot, man.
How many is killed on a daily basis? Can you give a kind of a vivid description, because the media will not really put it out there?
I mean, depends on the year, right? Because sometimes there's a full-on scale war, like bombing of Gaza, and those numbers go up. But on average, there's a Palestinian that dies every day, that is killed every day. Especially Palestinian children are being targeted. So yeah, it's a very violent structure, and there's almost not a day that goes by where we don't mourn the death of another Palestinian by this violent system.
All right. The second last question is, what can we do as the international community, but specifically South African youth, especially people watching this channel? What can we do?
I think
practical one thing that you can do.
I think nobody understands the context better than you, and the need for sanctions against Israel. And there needs to be a demand of your government, especially the ANC, that has been at the forefront of demanding sanctions on the apartheid regime, to levy sanctions on Israel. I mean, here's one example. Israelis do not need a visa to come to South Africa, but Palestinians do.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very minor sanction, right? And that's on the lowest level, but there's a lot that can be done. And I think this is very important. So we've been hearing a lot of rhetoric of solidarity for a very long time, but it's time for really concrete actions by governments, individuals, etc., to sanction the state for its apartheid regime.
All right. So what you're actually asking is that whenever we encounter, the government must ask for sanctions, and we need to put that pressure on it. And over some time, it was kind into the fees must fall demand for sanctions. Okay, the final question is something you ask us. What does freedom mean to you?
Wow. So I think my understanding of freedom has very much evolved. And yesterday, after our filming, I sat alone with the camera and spoke to it and kind of let those feelings out. But I think for me, freedom was the absence of domination by another. And I think that's what I believed. My right to movement, my right to have political rights, civil rights, within a social contract that gave me dignity, gave me justice, gave me equity, not equality, but equity. That was my conception of freedom. But I think it has evolved to also something very central, is to feel the freedom of belonging somewhere. And I think that's what fundamentally shifted during my time in South Africa, spending time with you and with the comrades over the last couple of days and going on that journey.
Right. Thank you very much. Man, this was great.
Thank you, brother.
I don't know how much views or things you get, but I think the message that is going out there, or that needs to go out there, is that what is happening in Palestine or in the Palestine-Israel region, because that territory for me is under contestation and it still needs to be called something. And what is going to be called in the future, that's it. But what is happening, the practices that's taking place there is apartheid. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Let's call it
what it is. Settler colonial apartheid.
Yeah. And if it's apartheid and if it's recognized as apartheid, it needs to be a crime against humanity because it's already declared a crime against humanity. So that's the first call of action is let's call it apartheid and let's put the pressure on that. The second thing is whenever we encounter anyone, let's call for sanctions because I think those are two practical things that we can do and not just rhetoric.
Exactly.
Of solidarity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, man.
Salem's details and channel. I will put below in the description and you guys can go and check it out. So, Salem.
Thank you, brother. It's been a pleasure.
Much.